Thanks to our title sponsor, Juniper Networks, for helping make Research Saturday possible. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CyberWire's Research Saturday. I'm Dave Bittner, and this is our weekly conversation with researchers and analysts tracking down threats and vulnerabilities, solving some of the hard problems of protecting ourselves in a rapidly evolving cyberspace. Thanks for joining us.
Basically, the investigation pretty much started like any other investigation. We were called in to figure out what happened in a company, to figure out what caused a potential breach.
That's Liviu Arsene. He's a senior cybersecurity analyst at Bitdefender. The research we're discussing today is titled APT Hackers for Hire, Used for Industrial Espionage. And now, a quick word about our sponsor, Juniper Networks. NSS Labs gave Juniper its highest rating of recommended in its recent data center security gateway test. To get your copy of the NSS Labs report, visit juniper.net/securedc or connect with Juniper on Twitter or Facebook. That's juniper.net/securedc. And we thank Juniper for making it possible to bring you Research Saturday. Thanks to our sponsor, Enveil, whose revolutionary zero-reveal solution protects data while it's being used or processed, the holy grail of data encryption. Enveil delivers privacy-preserving capabilities to enable critical business functions. Organizations can securely derive insights, cross-match, and search third-party data assets without ever revealing the contents of the interaction or compromising the ownership of the underlying data. What was once only theoretical is now possible with Enveil. Learn more at enveil.com.
We started doing the forensic analysis on some of the infected endpoints. We created a technical report based on our findings, and we presented it to the client, if you will, the customer. However, when we took a step back after completing the report, we took a step back and took another look at some of the fine print of what we found. And it was really interesting because we found three very interesting aspects to the investigation, which pretty much led us in the direction of an APT-style attack. And these three things basically were the entire attack occurred because of a zero-day vulnerability that was being used by attackers. There were some custom tools that were apparently specifically created for this attack. I mean, most of the time you see tools that are off the shelf when you see some sort of traditional attack going after this type of company. And then there was the motivation angle. If traditionally most of these companies that work in verticals that don't really or haven't really been touched by APT-style attacks, the motivation is usually financial. It's either ransomware demand or it's an extortion that the attacker is trying to achieve. But in this case, it was simply information collection, information exfiltration. So they had a very clear purpose in mind. And that's pretty much what tipped us off that something was going on that's, beyond the obvious. And when we basically corroborated that with some of our previous research, I remember us talking about last time, about a month ago, about another APT group like StrongPity. And, going back even further than that, earlier this year, we found some remote desktop components that were being used by TrickBot to target specific telecom companies in the US and Hong Kong. It kind of all seemed to fit a pattern, and the pattern was that what if cyber criminals, especially skilled cyber criminals like APT groups, were moving away from the politically motivated attacks towards, free professionals, if you will, or as-a-service attacks, where they could just offer their services to pretty much anybody interested in compromising a potential victim, a potential target, or a potential competitor in this case.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff for sure. There are many elements about this one that sort of caught my eye, beginning with the type of organization, as you say, that was being targeted here. Who were they going after?
Exactly. So this seems to be an organization that does architectural design. So their background is actually design, architecture, but they also do 3D production. When you have a blueprint for a building or some sort of project, you usually try to give your customer a 3D rendering of that project.
Right.
So this is what they do. They work closely with real estate, for example, and they have been actively involved in billion-dollar projects. And this is kind of weird because you don't see, or traditionally we haven't seen attacks on this type of vertical or this type of company profile, especially such sophisticated attacks.
And interesting to me is how they made their way in there. I mean, the payload came in as a plugin for some popular graphics software. What was going on there?
So that was an interesting one because when we did the investigation, we didn't know that was actually a zero-day vulnerability. So when we presented the report, we gave them all our findings. We told them that this is a malicious plugin that was pretty much tampering with the 3ds Max functionality. And only a couple of days before us publishing the report, we found 3ds Max publishing the vulnerability and the patch for it. So apparently these guys, whoever they were, these APT hackers for hire, they literally exploited a zero-day vulnerability before the software actually figured out that they have such a vulnerability. So whoever has the skills to find a zero-day vulnerability in 3ds Max definitely knew what they were doing.
Now, did you have any sense, or were you able to determine how this infected plugin got installed on the system? How they got, I guess, tricked into using it?
Unfortunately, no, because the company didn't have any sort of CM or tools meant for monitoring network traffic or monitoring everything from a security perspective for a very long time. So we could only see what we were allowed to see, if you will. But as it is with most of these attacks, I think it probably was some sort of spear phishing attack, or maybe as it was with the StrongPity APT group, maybe some sort of water holing attack, where the attackers know what the company profile is, they know what type of software they use, and maybe they use that against them, either compromise a popular plugin downloading website, or maybe trick them with some sort of a phony campaign of a new an interesting plugin. But unfortunately, that plugin was tainted.
Well, let's walk through it together. I mean, the way that this goes at the business that it does, the functionality, its capabilities. Can you take us through what you learned?
Absolutely. So basically, you have this first payload, if you will, which ends up on the victim's computer by exploiting a vulnerability in this 3ds Max computer software, mostly used for architectural design, 3D renderings. Afterwards, it brings with it a lot of other components, mostly used for crawling for specific files or specific file extensions. And then an additional component that involves stealing information like passwords or credentials, authentication credentials for various services. What was interesting about the crawler, for example, is that it seems to be custom built for this specific victim. I mean, it specifically skips some extensions, like media files, both, for example, JPEG or MPEG files, and it doesn't archive them. It has the ability to just directly upload them to the attacker-controlled server, the command and control server belonging to the attacker. It also has the ability to allow the attacker to simply browse through any other directory or drive from the victim's computers, including network-attached drives, for example. So these were basically tools that we haven't seen actually in any attack. And we have looked in our telemetry, and they were very, very scarce. I mean, maybe they deployed them on other victims just to test them, but it seems that they were really put to good use in this particular case.
And it was capable of taking screenshots as well?
Exactly. So it had the ability to take screenshots. It had the ability to collect usernames, computer names, IP addresses, It had the ability to, or it was specifically tied, if you will, to a user on a computer. So you wouldn't find the same payload on two different usernames, two different computers. So I guess that was mostly because whoever was behind it wanted to know exactly what victim they infected. I mean, from whom inside the organization they were collecting that sort of telemetry.
It was interesting to me, too, in your research that you noted that this software seemed to be intentional in not drawing too much attention to itself.
Exactly. So another interesting aspect was that whenever it would find that task manager or some sort of performance monitoring app was running, it would automatically stop doing whatever it was doing to consume CPU power. We believe that maybe it's the type of behavior I employed, in order not to raise any alarm bells to the victim. For example, if you're running 3ds Max and you're doing a lot of processing, and you notice that all of a sudden your CPU starts consuming more CPU cycles than normally, then you would naturally open Task Manager to see what processes and what services are running, to see what's clogging up performance. And maybe they just hid their processes, the malicious processes, in order not to attract any attention whenever these high performance activities were going on the victim's computer, just to fly below the radar.
Yeah, that's interesting because, it's been my experience that the folks who are doing these sorts of 3D rendering jobs, they're looking to squeeze every bit of performance out of the machines as possible. So it's just interesting that the bad guys were aware of that and tried not to raise any flags there.
Exactly. So it's actually interesting because, it's a first to see that bad guys don't want to, interfere with your daily activities. They just want to leave you do your stuff. And while you're not using the computer, they'll use it for you.
Now, what sort of information were you able to glean in terms of the command and control server?
So as it is with most APTs, it's difficult to say just who is behind them or where the cyber criminals are based. But in this case, we know that the command and control infrastructure seems to be based in South Korea. That doesn't necessarily mean that these hackers, these APT hackers for hire, are also based in South Korea. As we've seen with previous APT groups, they can be scattered across the world. So this just might be maybe the first tier in their infrastructure or something that they've commissioned specifically for a job. So in this case, this makes attribution a lot more difficult. And I think this is going to be the trend from now on. If this whole thing turns into an APT as a service, if you will, it's going to make attribution for security researchers a lot more difficult, because if until now you've had political motivations, like state-sponsored APT groups, or if you've had financial motivations, take Carbon Act, for example, we know that they targeted financial institutions. Now, if you have APTs as a service, you may find yourself in a pickle, because attribution is going to be a lot more difficult, and finding out the purpose, the reason, or the motivation behind an attack is going to be a lot more difficult.
Is it, I suppose, plausible that this could be some folks working for an APT group that are taking side jobs?
We were just asking ourselves that around the office, because there's not a lot of people that have the skills to do this. To find a zero-day vulnerability and actually use it on, let's say, a relatively low-profile victim. Plus, it's not uncommon, or it's not unlikely, if you will, to that part of these APT groups, there could be members that either used to operate, or still operate for state-sponsored APT groups, and that have simply, band with other skilled individuals to make some money on the side. If we're talking about as a service, it's pretty much like software outsourcing. You find a good developer, you try to co-opt him for a project, and he's giving you his best, basically. So it wouldn't surprise me if these guys were basically trained and skilled by nation states, or they've honed their skills in various other APT-style attacks and APT groups like Carbon Act. So this could also be a possibility. Yeah.
And what was it that tipped the victim off that they had an issue here and made them bring you all in?
Basically, there were a couple of alarms and bells from their network traffic analysis solution, and they pretty much wanted to call us in and investigate to see if there's something going on with their endpoints.
Have you had any indication that there are other organizations that are fallen victim to a similar type of attack?
As far as we know, no, because whenever we looked at this infrastructure, this specific infrastructure used in this attack, there were no signs that it was communicating to other victims or that it was receiving some sort of telemetry from other victims. Even the payloads or the tools that we found in this particular example seem to be unique for this client. So we haven't seen them, at least from our telemetry perspective, we haven't seen them anywhere.
And so what are your recommendations for organizations to protect themselves against this sort of thing?
Well, I think this kind of changes the whole threat landscape, if you will, or the whole threat paradigm for small, medium-sized, or even large businesses. Well, maybe not so much for large businesses, but maybe for small and medium-sized businesses. And I say that because if until now APTs were mostly something that large corporations, large organizations had to worry about, it was part of their threat model, if you will. Now, with APTs as a service and pretty much being available to anyone who's willing to, open up their pockets, could be a problem for small and medium-sized businesses. And let's just take a scenario, for example. Imagine you're a small, mid-sized business. Let's take this particular example. You're a small, mid-sized business that works in architecture and design, for example, and you want to bid for a contract in a multi-billion-dollar real estate project. But you're not alone bidding for that project. There are other larger companies with bigger budgets that want, the inside scoop. What if those larger companies could turn to these APT hackers for hire to compromise you to see what kind of deals you're trying to strike with the contract, or they're trying to find out how you're planning your negotiations to get the contract, and that means they could be turning against you. They could be turning these APT hackers for hire against small or medium-sized businesses just to gain the upper hand, to gain leverage. If we're talking about large contracts, large projects, it would make sense for these kind of APT hackers for hire to be used on SMBs.
Yeah, and I have to say this was a bit of an eye-opener to me, having throughout my career made use of various programs like this, graphics programs, audio editing programs, and so many of these software packages make use of plugins. And they have third-party plugins, they come from a variety of sources. And I think in my mind, a plugin for a package like this has always been something sort of benign in my mind in terms of a security issue. I never really imagined that a plugin for a package like this could bring with it security issues, and this sort of changes that game.
Exactly. So basically, you can look at plugins as any other application that you install. It's code, it's new code that's running on your machine, either in an application or your operating system, that could be doing wrong stuff, illegitimate stuff. So this is something that you have to worry, both as a large or mid-sized organization. But the interesting thing is that this type of, if you will, service, APT hackers as a service, is something that we kind of, if you look back, we were kind of expecting this to happen. I mean, just look at malware, for example. For the past decade, it has evolved from traditional malware, some malware developer trying out code and then infecting victims, to malware as a service, where malware developers no longer focused on the infection part of the attack chain. They simply focused on developing the malware and selling it. Look at ransomware. You had ransomware that was going after the average user. So there was the ransomware developer and then going after the average user with ransomware demands anywhere between $200 to $700. And then you had ransomware as a service, when they, again, focused more on the development part and the service part, offering ransomware to those who were interested and then making a cut off each ransom demand. So I guess APTs, this evolution towards APTs as a service, it shouldn't come as a shocker for everybody. So it's kind of like a natural evolution.
It also strikes me that this sort of highlights the importance of of having that defense in depth, of not only looking for things like signatures, but as this case points out, looking for behaviors, unusual activity on your network.
Exactly. So this, again, if large companies usually have the budgets, the manpower, or even the SOC teams, that are capable of uncovering, if you will, these types of attack tactics and techniques that revolve around stealth or persistency, it's the small and mid-sized businesses that will have an issue with dealing with these APT-style attacks. I mean, it's already bad enough that skill shortage is an issue, is a thing. There's also the issue of neurodiversity. For example, when you want to build your own IT or security teams, you need to make sure that they all have a diverse background, especially security background. And there's also the matter of budget. Not any company can afford to have their in-house security teams. Now, I think the security industry is going to adapt to these as well. So if security, or you can do so much from a security stack perspective, endpoint security, network security, EDR security. I think you can also manage the skill shortage security by, turning to, for example, MDR solutions, managed detection and response solutions, which basically means you have your own SWAT team. You can hire your own IT or security SWAT team to come in and investigate whenever there's a problem. So I think the threat landscape shouldn't scare us so much, because I think there's always going to be the security counter perspective that addresses that problem.
Our thanks to Liviu Arsene from Bitdefender for joining us. The research is titled APT Hackers for Hire, Used for Industrial Espionage. We'll have a link in the show notes. Thanks to Juniper Networks for sponsoring our show. You can learn more at juniper.net/security or connect with them on Twitter or Facebook. Thanks to Enveil for their sponsorship. You can find out how they're closing the last gap in data security at enveil.com. The CyberWire Research Saturday is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technologies. Our amazing CyberWire team is Elliot Peltzman, Puru Prakash, Stefan Vaziri, Kelsey Bond, Tim Nodar, Joe Kerrigan, Carol Terrio, Ben Yellen, Nick Valecki, Gina Johnson, Bennett Moe, Chris Russell, John Petrick, Jennifer Iben, Rick Howard, Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.